Thanks all for having me. I'm happy to give you a background on myself. I promise I am far less interesting than the work that we do, though. My name's Drew Edwards. I lead an organization called Pangea. We've been around since about 2011 or so. Most of my background is in development and education, or at least my training, and most of my work has been kind of in different post-conflict and crisis settings where we do a lot of education work. Our mission, to be a bit more specific, is we develop culturally relevant content and programs that help children learn to read and inspire them to read more often. Oddly enough, we've sort of expanded that mission just a little bit to affect those populations in different ways, one of which we have partnered with the University of Florida. And so we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. But I figured as we're jumping through, I'm happy to tell you all about our work and a little bit more about the work that we're doing with Florida. But I want to do an activity to kick off. And so are we okay to start with everyone that we have here?
Yep, you can go ahead and kick it off.
All right, sounds good. So this is the piece where we needed a piece of paper and a writing utensil. What you're looking at is what we call an identity circle. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is identity. And I think what's really helpful is identity is something that we often sort of take for granted or don't, a lot of folks may not think about, especially folks that might look like myself, especially in more sort of dominant in groups than other folks. And so I want you to just take a piece of paper and draw a circle, and I want you to replicate what's on your screen. So now, after you draw the circle, you may be wondering what's the best way to get, the perfect pie chart here. Start with one line across and then try to evenly split that into 6 even pieces. And so as you do that, I'm going to talk about each of these and give just a brief definition of what they are. One is socioeconomic status. The other one is nationality. Sexual orientation, race, gender, and religion. So socioeconomic status is something that you could probably use as a synonym for class in the United States. Nationality is possibly what citizenship that you identify with or sort of citizenship status that affects a few different people different ways. Sexual orientation or sexual preferences, race, is sort of our phenotypical expression of our identity here in the United States. Another one is gender, so how we identify separate from our sex, and then religion, which may be something folks' religious beliefs or their sort of ontological beliefs, I guess, because we're in the university setting here. So now that you have that, I want you to take just sort of part of these circles and we want you to tear away half of them. So I want you to just take a minute to reflect which 3 are least important to you. And I want you to physically tear them away. Don't do the easy thing where you scratch it out. We want you to kind of take the moment to feel the pain of tearing away part of who you are. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to take your time to do that. And as you're thinking about those, these are ones that are probably least important to you now, today. Because you may be thinking, maybe these have changed from time to time. Maybe they changed how they felt yesterday, and maybe even several years ago as you yourself have changed. But as you're feeling today and what you're reflecting on, what you're thinking on, what are the 3 of these identities that are least important to you? All right, we'll have a little discussion about this in a second. So we'll dive more, but just take your own mental notes on how you're feeling about that. Now, we're left with 3. And so, your top 3 are an interesting reflection, or maybe your bottom 3 are also an interesting reflection. Depends on if you're a half glass full or half empty kind of person. I want you to eliminate one more, just to get down to your final 2. So eliminate one more that's not in those top 2 or not most important to you. All right, and if you have them handy, some people scrunch them up real quick. If you have them handy, if you can keep them almost in a row of what you tore away, sometimes it's helpful to remind yourself as we talk about these a little bit. But now we're left with 2. And so as you're looking at those 2, I want you to tear away one more and see which identity is most important to you today. Okay, so we're going to go into a little bit of a discussion. I have a couple of reflection questions here that I want to share with everybody. But in general, unmute yourself. I really want to have a discussion. I find discussions are a lot more engaging and fun than me just talking at you, especially about you and your identities. And so I guess one, I would love to know from the ones that were left, the identity squares that were left for you, what was the most important to you? Feel free to jump in, anyone that wants to share.
I think for me, the last one that I ended up putting was definitely race followed by gender. Me being a historian, I am aware of the varying perceptions of people who are not white and how they were perceived historically. So I mean, I do recognize that even the fact that me being white, that there's definitely a privilege with being of that race when it comes to certain markets. It's not fair that that's the case, but unfortunately that is the case.
Sure. It makes a lot of sense, and it's really hard, and it's especially really important lately. So appreciate your reflection on that. Did anyone else have a different one, a different identity that was most important to them?
I'll go ahead. I mean, the one that I left on at the very end was gender, because I think my gender has influenced so much of my life and who I am and what my career has been and what I do and things like that. So that was the one I held on to.
That's so interesting. That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Was there any that were really difficult for anyone to tear away? Sometimes when you're in those top 2, and AJ, you already kind of referenced this, it's one closely followed by the other. Did anyone have a really hard time tearing away one of those identities?
Yeah, for me, I think the 2 ones that was the most difficult to tear away was first the gender of recognizing that I'm also a male, but then also your socioeconomic status. I mean, I come from a poor background and a very poor family. So I mean, I've not been as financially privileged as other people in the city that I've grown up in. My mom's even told me a story where she had some lady in the city that we live in basically snub her nose at her because, and she quote unquote told her, I just don't like you because you don't come from old money.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, the socioeconomic status and the gender was definitely one of the more harder ones. I was kind of also stumped on nationality. I do feel that I am, a lot of the decisions and the person that I am today has been majorly influenced by the fact that I am an American. Yeah. And then potentially religion was one of the other ones that I also had I had a hard time pulling all of them because I think all of these factors influence the person that you are today.
Right. Well, and that's I think you hit the nail on the head. I was going to say it sounded like there were quite a few that were hard to tear away there a little bit. And I think you reflect interesting points, and I don't want to dive into all of that quite yet because I think there's a larger discussion there. But I think your reflections are really important and interesting, which are that identity is, one, multifaceted, but 2, in many ways they influence each other too, right? As much as they influence us. Maybe another question for folks: were there any of these identities that were least important to you?
I had a pretty easy time taking off religion. I'm agnostic atheist, so almost the absence of. So I had a pretty easy time pulling that off. And for those of you who know, I am about to move to Uganda full time. So the nationality one initially felt really easy to pull off because, I won't be residing in the country where I'm from, but even upon further reflection, that's going to play a huge part in my ability to move throughout the world and my ability to move to another country. So I can only move to Uganda full time with an American passport, whereas it's not the same the other way around. Ugandans can't just come to the US with their current policy. So further reflection, like that was super easy to just get rid of right away, but thinking about it, you know, maybe not so much.
That's very, very fair. And it's interesting how that changes over time, right? I mean, you kind of referenced sort of a time relevance to nationality being particularly important. Did anyone else have another identity that was least important, that was different?
Hi, Drew. I think in my case, well, I'm from Costa Rica, and I agree with Katie. The least important for me is religion, but because I'm here in the United States. If you ask me that in my country, a lot of these characteristics would change. For example, my socioeconomic status would be important. Here is not important. I'm a student, so it doesn't matter. But in my country, that matters a lot. So everything would play differently if I'm here or if I'm in Costa Rica. And I thought that would be very interesting. That's very interesting.
Right. Oh, it's super interesting. It's interesting too, because you're now bringing in a place relevance to a lot of this in addition to Katie's time relevance. Here's another question for y'all, or maybe before I say that, I love a little bit of argument and some conjecture. And so I think one of them that is important to me is actually gender was least important to me. And I say that as, you know, heterosexual, white, American male. It's just not something that I think about. And it's something that I'm constantly having to I have to work really hard to remind myself about this. I also live and work in Uganda, like where Katie's going. And that male privilege is a very, very significant privilege in Uganda. And it's something that I'm really I am not always very cognizant of. Whereas for many folks, that may be your most important identity. And so maybe a follow-up question is, what identities do you think we're missing out of this circle?
Yeah, that's a good one. Education level.
Sure, absolutely. That's a huge one. Anybody else have any others?
Discipline. It's actually related to education, what you're educated in. And yeah, being a scientist, being a biologist.
Right, incredibly different. Walk around the university, you're gonna walk in all kinds of different people. That's a great one. Any others in addition to education and discipline of education? What about language? Sometimes language and culture are often, you know, they're deeply sort of tied and associated. Any others come up to mind for anybody?
Tall.
What was that?
Being tall.
Being tall, yeah, absolutely. And maybe related to that, what about ability status, right? I mean, that's an interesting, diverse abilities dramatically affect how you can move in different places in community, campus, or in the world.
How about occupation?
Yeah, certainly. Say more about that.
No, well, it's just that some groups identify themselves with the work that they do. So if you're a oyster harvester when you lose that job, it's much more than just the income. It's who you are, or how you view yourself. So that's why I'm thinking about occupation as a identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And even within that, you mentioned this, but that sub-identity of employed versus not employed. Yeah, all of those are so important. And I guess part of the point of this is that it's impossible to put all identities onto, you know, a piece of paper and try to tear them away. And one thing that I would even, I think, probably make an assertion of, is that, you know, identity is not a categorical variable, right? And often we make it that. Right. So what does it mean to be one color versus another color in the United States? Right. And the blend of how you choose to identify, ultimately, it's up to you to decide that. But it is quite difficult to find and define those differences. And so one of our assertions as an organization and for myself and my own research is that all of these identities are actually more continuous variables, and we have to be careful about how we place them. And certainly you can create a category. We can get into a whole statistical argument there, but the larger argument here, I think, is that It's quite important when we're thinking and talking about identity that it may mean something different to you than it might mean to someone else. And that can shift and sort of change or oscillate based on the place that we're at in our life and what's going on around us, the place that we might be studying or working, the place that we might be living, or the place that we might be from. And as a result, when we talk about identity throughout the rest of this, but maybe as we're thinking about it in the rest of our lives too, it's just important to keep that in mind and tread thoughtfully about what that might mean to somebody else. So this is just, again, just our intro reflection for some of the things that we're going to talk about. And so we'll dive into a little bit of what our actual work is here. So as we dive in, I'll tell you a little bit about our organization. We kind of shared the mission. We've been working in Uganda since 2009. So coming up on 12 years now, I guess. And I want to give you some background on Uganda in particular. We actually work in several other countries as well, but this is the place where I think it's helpful to focus on for this discussion. Uganda is a wonderful place, wonderful, wonderful place. And unfortunately at the left, the reason I have to kind of give you the background as to why we work there. We're trying to solve a problem. And so you're going to see some deficit stats. One of them is that there's a really low primary completion rate. So that means folks that actually graduate from primary school, it's about 54%. When we look at kids who are graduating themselves, so grade 7 students, what are they actually learning? Only 39% can read at a grade 2 level. And what that means for most folks is the ability to be able to read and write 2 to 3 sentences in a language familiar to yourself. Within this, you look at Uganda, you look at all these districts, and you might say, well, Uganda is an interesting country. It's about the size of the state of Oregon. How complicated or diverse could it be? Very complicated and very diverse. One of those is that, Uganda has 54 officially recognized languages, not dialects. There's even further dialects underneath that. And so one of these big challenges around literacy is that there aren't a sufficient number of books in local languages around folks as they're learning in school in general. A great note here from Katie. It's the 4th most ethnically diverse country in the world. I did not know that, and that doesn't surprise me. So really, really interesting. And then, there's this other piece here. 99% of illiterate children themselves have illiterate parents. And one more piece, because, we typically actually work in informal education. We focus on working outside of schools with a lot of our work. 72% of children's waking hours are at home or in the community, so not in the classroom. And especially in the last 2 years, since March 2020, Ugandan schools have been closed and are still closed. They have not opened since the pandemic. And so a lot of our focus before that was on informal education outside of school or community-based education. And now it's even more so focused on in the community. So we're hoping that changes soon. We're for the 6th time, we've been told that they're going to open, and supposedly that happens in January. But until then, there's some other things to dive into and talk about. Before we dive into that, I guess any questions on sort of background for the context that we're talking about here? I know it's hard to ask questions about stats, but I do want to create space for that. Okay, I'm going to keep plugging away. Always feel free to throw any questions or any comments, any concerns into the chat, and feel free to do so publicly. So we're going to jump on to the next one. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work, but we're going to focus on a particular area. So we actually work in 3 spheres of a child's life. One is in the classroom. So we train teachers how to teach literacy and how to use literacy materials, books in the classroom, especially for bilingual or trilingual environments. And that type of literacy is particular in different languages. So the concept of morphology in language. Different languages are harder or easier to move to based on your prior knowledge in another language. The other work that we do is at home. We have a large mobile library service that checks out about 250,000 to 500,000 books a year, depending on if there's a pandemic going on. And we do a lot of that, especially in the refugee camps in northwestern Uganda. So it's a subscription service in many ways. So there are folks that pay some, and there are a lot of folks living in a refugee camp that do not pay anything. And then our area that we're going to focus on today, and really the largest area of our work, is our work. What I put here is in the community, but largely it's our development of learning materials for communities. And these are culturally relevant learning materials. So I'll tell you a little bit about our publishing. We just started it in 2018. This is not actually what we've done for a long time, and now it's all that we basically do. We published 124 books since then in 15 languages. Our books have been read by 4.5 million folks in 54 countries around the world. We are trying to sort of level some of identity deficiencies that we see in literature, and kids literature and kids learning materials. And so 96% of our main characters are female, or our protagonists are female. In fact, most of our characters tend to be female as well. 100% are written and illustrated by authors from communities represented. So I am not a writer, and so I'm not a good writer. I'm not particularly, I don't particularly enjoy it. And as a result, I also can't represent other places. And what you'll commonly see within Uganda, but also in many countries as well, is that many people are writing or speaking on behalf of other folks. And this has a lot of significant fallouts, right? We have really low comprehension rates of materials that are used. One good example is, I think 88% of texts that are in libraries across Uganda are donated texts from outside of the country. Simultaneously, and this is not causal, so don't hold me to this, but simultaneously, 11%, or there's an 11% comprehension rate for kids graduating elementary school. So comprehending the text that they're reading in front of them. We think that's correlated. That's what a lot of our work is around, and that's what a lot of our sort of theory of change is around. So we're trying to sort of level that out a little bit. And then as a result, I'll stop talking at you just right after this, but our core focus has been on a couple different types of books. One is we leverage oral folklore. When we talked about that other stat on the prior page, we talked about 99% of kids who are illiterate have illiterate parents. One way to engage parents, one way not to disenfranchise parents in the conversation based on their level of education, and usually there's an association with socioeconomic status here, is that folklore in Uganda, and if you want to get someone talking, just ask them about their favorite story. I'll tell you, they'll talk for hours. And in fact, we do this, and this is how we actually collect folklore. We have storytelling events like this picture here, in which we just get folks together. We call it sodas and stories, and we provide soda for everybody. And we try to just allow folks to tell more of their own stories in their own language. And we record those, we dictate them, we translate them, we illustrate them, and then we're donating them back to the same communities or in the libraries that are in those communities, and trying to share those not only within those communities, but across Uganda. Uganda also has a lot of challenges with discrimination between many of those different cultures that we're talking about. And there's a lot of really positive things to share between those places. And so we're trying to usurp some of those sort of implicit and unconscious biases, but that's my secondary mission. That's not our mission. So, the other piece is that we make phonics readers. So if anyone's ever done Hooked on Phonics, I did when I was a kid. We're trying to make things that are a little bit more educational than just words on a page that look somewhat familiar to a place. And then the very last one, and this will get into some of the work we've been doing with the University of Florida, are original stories. And we don't make a ton of original stories, actually. I would say since the pandemic, it's accelerated. Maybe 40% of our work are now original story, but that's largely because we have been very cautious about the possibility of spreading or being vessels for COVID during community gatherings in the last couple of years here. So that's shifted a little bit. So let's go into a little bit more of what this looks like, because the question then kind of becomes like, all right, Drew, you're talking about books. I understand what books are. You're talking about making them relevant, but what could this possibly really look like? How relevant might they be? And so I want to show you almost a little bit of a case study. We make cultural adaptations for the work that we do to make sure they're culturally relevant. And so in March 2020, when all of the world's school doors were closed, two things happened. One, kids started to go out of school, and like we mentioned in Uganda, they're going to be out of school for a very long time. Two, Drew, myself, became very frustrated with the poor communication around science and just generally from how everything around closures were communicated. And so, we were really lucky though, because the United States had a heads up compared to the rest of the world, which I guess isn't lucky in many ways. But for the sake of developing these products, we ended up writing a series called The Unwelcome Stranger. Now this series makes up, when we talk about our stats, 4.5 million kids reading this, about 2.5 million of those came within a month of when we published this. So we made this series in 16 days. We made it available online for free, and it's been read in 55 different countries, and it's sort of spread like rapid fire. This was featured by Forbes, CBS. I'll talk about UNESCO did a study on it, But we made adaptations for 4 different cultural regions and 15 different languages. So what that ended up sort of looking like was, how could what's the anatomy of a culturally differentiated book, I guess. One of these are that we try to accommodate particular figures. This is an example of what we call a wisdom figure in a book. So in a crisis, who in a family would be in charge of communicating these things with children, making them understandable, telling them what's going on, telling them why things are closing, even if they don't know, which none of us did. And so in many countries that we work in, they're patriarchal. But when we go to Sudan, for instance, where we do some other work, the Ministry of Education asked us to make an adaptation because it's matriarchal, and it would never be the grandfather who would be communicating this. We talk about the Middle East, and you also look at the context here. These are happening around a fire in the central part here. We don't do a good job of showing it in this image, but the other one was coffee for Sudan. And then it's the same coffee in the Middle East for the Gulf region when we made an adaptation there. The UNESCO just released a report last week, and we're excited because they were favorably reporting on our work. Our books have elicited a 95.9% comprehension rate when they are culturally, linguistically adapted, and also time adapted significantly affects this actually, compared to the 11% average. And we're really, really proud of this. We're really, really excited about this because not only does this mean something for literacy, but you might be thinking, what about the work that you all might be doing if you're communicating in any communities that you're doing work in? What does it mean for actually comprehending and sharing across different stakeholders when we're talking about information? It turns out the University of Florida wanted to know this as well. And so we had a task to develop a flip book that creates sort of understanding around the benefits of vaccinating livestock with particular attention to women's livestock. And you all can read very well, so I'll let you read the rest of that there. But the big key here was the inclusion of women in this, something that's incredibly countercultural and something that's also difficult to communicate because women are actually far less literate than other folks in the same community, than men in the same community. And so we made 4 different adaptations of this, language adaptations, but with language often comes culture. And so if you have a keen eye, you might notice of the 3 or 4 different versions that are up here, not only are there different languages across each, but there's also different sort of dress and customs that are taking place in each of these. And these are nice, really high level comparisons about clothes that people might wear and how they might communicate in the communities. And these are all within 100 miles of each other. So very, very stark differences between these. This isn't on here right now, but we're working on an adaptation for the same program in Nepal. And hopefully, I think there's a couple other places where it's taking place. So if you work in Senegal, we're pitching the University of Florida on this right now. So, but this ended up looking just a little bit, we ended up doing what's called a flip book. So these are not actually like fold out books. They're books that flip so that community health workers are able to flip between a picture and then read the story on the back end of it. Although these are staying and available in communities and folks might actually read them, they're meant to more be sort of oratory kind of helping tools to kind of read through a story and talk through a story. Now you might be sitting there and saying like, this is great. I'm glad that you culturally adapted these. Is a story the most effective way to communicate this? For this circumstance and for this work, we found that it is. And there's actually a guy, he's a cognitive science at University of Virginia named Daniel T. Willingham. Does a lot of research sort of on the use of storytelling in education. And one thing that he has indicated in what we think is pretty consensus research to this date until it's been disproven is that stories are also psychologically privileged in terms of how things are, how they engage with memory, right? Like memory by definition is sort of this residue of thought. And so you have to get people to think and spend time, and you also have to get them to associate and engage with those stories. So for instance, as we were starting our conversation, I hope that you're engaged now, but the hope was that if you reflect on your own identity, there might be other associations that you may be reflecting and thinking and possibly more open to hearing when we're talking and reflecting on other people's identity. So this is largely it. This is sort of the high level sort of presentation. I wanted to give that because, again, a discussion, I could lecture at you, but most, education science says that you're not going to listen if we go much longer. So I thought it would be better just to have a discussion about some of this, and we can take it any direction that you might find with work that you're working on and how an application of some of these concepts might might work in the work that you're doing, or we are also happy to talk about a little bit more of the details of the work that we have done or that we're doing with the University of Florida. And Katie was nice to put some details of folks that we are working with on this as well. So I'm going to pause there. I have excellent wait time as a teacher myself, so happy to sit awkwardly for a little while, but I do want to see if folks have any questions about maybe starting with the work that we are doing, and then maybe we can expand beyond that just after there.